Alright, welcome back to the channel. We have finally made it to the college football playoff where we have all the matchups we've gone through the entire season, and we figured out how everything's supposed to go, how everything had turned out. There's been a bit of bumps and bruises on the way. A lot of it did not end up going near the way we were expecting. With my subscription to the Athletic, one person that I do keep up with a lot of the analytics and a lot of the numbers on college football within itself is Chris Vannini, one of their senior writers. And since 2017, he's made an effort of ranking all 136 teams in college football based off of the team merit, how the analytics actually run out, and how they actually would be against everyone else. Now, here's one of his articles, this very first one of this college football season, all the way back in mid-August. It does not feel like I've been doing this for 4 months. This has really flown by. But going off of it, we go through the top 10 on here, where we have all the contenders who we thought were going to be the contenders. Penn State got all the hype, Clemson all the hype, Texas, Ohio State being a repeat champ. And then you see at those top 10, half of those teams don't make the field. Going off of the second tier, the ones that could battle for those spots, you had Miami, you had Ole Miss, Indiana surprising everyone, A&M, Texas Tech, Oklahoma. And with that is most of the teams that did end up making the field. The last two were the group of 5 teams. But taking a look at the final field of the bracket and where they were put in Vannini's opening field through the entire 136, none of the top 3 are there. 5 of the top 10 aren't in the field. Actually, make it 6 of the top 10 aren't in the field. And then you had surprises. A&M was a pleasant surprise. Indiana, while making the field, basically is one of the last team in with a lackluster schedule in 24. Texas Tech surprised, as you felt like someone in the Big 10, in the Big 12 was going to make it. Oklahoma was a little bit more of a pleasant surprise on defense. And even with the group of 5 teams, you had Tulane at 38 overall. They were the second highest group of 5 team that he projected in the entirety of the whole thing. And Boise State was the first one thought to be the favorite next season after Ashton Jeanty went pro. And then James Madison ended up being 4th. And they've been a perennial group of 5 power since they've come up from the FCS. So at 43, very respectable. The 4th highest. Only Navy was between Tulane and James Madison. And Navy also ended up being a factor almost throughout the entirety of the season. Tulane's 2 losses ended up being to Texas San Antonio, as honestly a monumental upset for them. And then getting themselves handed to by Ole Miss, who they conveniently get to play again. And then James Madison's only loss against a solid, if not great, Louisville team. 2-touchdown loss to the Cardinals. Penn State 1, Clemson 2, Texas 3, Ohio State 4. Arizona State ended up being the Big 12 representative. You had Clemson being the only ACC. And then you had where Ohio State, Penn State, and Illinois and Oregon in the SEC, in the Big 10, and then Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and LSU being in the SEC, and then Notre Dame with itself. So you had all of these looking like pretty juicy matchups if this would end up being what happened in the early portion of the playoffs, especially that first round. You get LSU that will have gone all the way to Oregon to play them, for a chance for LSU to have a rematch against Clemson. In this case, Clemson probably would have won this game, at least the opening game of the season. Then you have Texas potentially going against Notre Dame, Ohio State against Georgia in the second round of the playoffs, and then probably Alabama, Penn State. Who would have thought that would have been anything bad coming into the season? Then the season happens. Just week 1 in itself. You have LSU beat Clemson. You had Florida State surprisingly beats Alabama. And the whole world goes crazy for the tide's going down. The dynasty's over with Saban being gone. DeBoer can't keep it up. You had Texas losing to Ohio State in a close game. Arch isn't very good. Clemson losing a tight game to LSU. LSU is a defense. Is Clemson able to get any sort of running game? Notre Dame, they lose to Miami. Is Miami and Carson Beck the real deal? That's all from just the 1 week. And then in the other case, the Big 12 representative in Utah. All right. And then South Florida, after blowing out Boise State 34-7, maybe Boise State's not back again without Genty. And then a few little changes off of it. LSU becomes the 1, Ohio State 2. Florida State goes from completely off the board to 3. Still a lot of matchups people love to see. Going up into week 2, not too much has changed. None of the week 2 and week 3, none of the big teams really got any more upsets. Yes, Clemson hasn't really looked that impressive even in their win. South Florida still keeping their spot as the group of 5. Week 3, that's at the point where also same way, not really that much difference. You finally do have Tulane getting its first notice as a group of 5 for the fact that at this point they've already beaten 2 teams that are in Power 4 conferences, blowing out Northwestern to open the season, and you had them beating Duke, which at this point even looks even more impressive. And then you have a few teams that are being early surprises that we kind of have to keep an eye on, see if they're going to be any sort of a factor. We'll come back to a few of them. You see randomly Vandy, Oklahoma, Auburn. A lot of those SEC probably going to sort themselves out. Just Auburn, Oklahoma, Vandy, Ole Miss, and Missouri. All of them above Alabama. Then we go just after a month of the season. We now have a point. Florida State's got their first loss against Virginia. We don't really know how good Virginia is at that point, but probably don't think of them that great. Virginia's hadn't really been that much of power, but they did get Chandler Morris as a 6-year transfer, kind of leading him in. Alabama's kind of picked themselves up, and they've beaten Georgia, really kind of dominated a bit of that game, even though it was as close as it was. And it's like, oh, Florida State's actually really good. Alabama just had a bad first week. And then in the same case, LSU falls down after losing to Ole Miss in a battle of unbeatens. Ole Miss goes all the way up to 5. Indiana is all the way up to 7 as an undefeated team. Yeah, Alabama went up from 19 on the previous week. One thing you started to notice of teams like LSU, that was all hyped up. They could not score with anybody. Like, if their defense was not bailing them out, if they couldn't hold a team under 20 points at this point, they weren't going to get a victory. And then it's like you have Penn State starting to slowly go down the strands of James Franklin issues. They go into double overtime against Oregon, lose against Oregon, but a very close game. Unfortunately, once again, James Franklin could not win the big game for Penn State to get them over the hump into one of the perennial powers into the playoff. But everyone else from the early weeks, they've kind of stayed stat as is. Then we're now getting into October. We have Miami getting a lot of hype. We have Oklahoma, Ole Miss, A&M all still undefeated. And one thing you actually have to see going into week 6, look at the top 10. All 10 of them made the playoff. Every single one. We are not even in halfway through the season. All 10 have made it, and then we have the 2 group of 5s. For the first half of the year, we thought that the group of 5 was going to be a competition between, for the most part, especially after Tulane got blown out by Ole Miss, it was going to be South Florida versus Memphis. Whoever was going to win that game later on in the season, as they were playing in November, they're going to be the group of 5 representative. And Notre Dame, you see them starting to lurch up. They lost their first 2 games of the season, losing to Miami, who's number 1, and A&M, who's number 6 in these polls. So now that they've won a few games, now that they have a winning record again, and still just behind Vandy, whenever Vandy's only loss is to Alabama. Vandy's just keeping themselves around. And then you see Georgia Tech not really getting that much respect in the ACC. And then you have all the way down below a group of 5 team is number 25, BYU. Big 12 representative, completely unbeaten. Yes, their non-conference was not great, but the Big 12, they have 9 conference games. They're going to battle within each other, and the top 2 are going to end up coming on top, playing each other for a second time. You think if they actually have at least those 2 games with that top representative, they would get more credit. And you really never saw it coming. Going into how things were after week 6. You have Carson Beck looking great at Miami. That completely is turning around Mario Cristobal's tenure at Miami, and Beck is not being near as turnover prone as he was at Georgia. That got him kicked out of town. Ohio State and Oregon has stayed up top. Ohio State still not that much of a schedule, and Oregon, a lot of it is being built up based off of the win against Penn State. And Oklahoma, a lot of theirs is getting built up with a win against Auburn, which early on in the season, Auburn was playing with some of the big boys. But some of the other powers in the Power 4 conferences like that, Arizona State, they lost to Mississippi State, and Mississippi State didn't even make a bowl game. But still, week 6, we're a month and a half into the season. You look at that 7-10 matchup that we could have had, and really we still could have it. Alabama gets a rematch against Georgia. In this case, based off of what we know now, would be a 3rd time. But yeah, you see how everything looks. A&M, Missouri, both of those teams joined the SEC at the same time, and both of them had a chance to potentially make the playoffs at the same moment. Through week 6, they're undefeated in that time. Oklahoma, so 3 of the 4 newest SEC teams are making it into the second playoff, the second 12-team playoff at this point. Ole Miss still riding high on the undefeated season. Indiana's had a cakewalk season kind of still. And Texas Tech still being, Texas Tech coming up as the Big 12 favorite and really steamrolling through everyone. Like, whenever I end up watching actually that Texas Tech BYU game and just how Texas Tech had been through that season, every team they won by double digits, besides that one game against Arizona State that they lost that their starting quarterback was hurt. But I'm rambling. Now, mid-season, we're in week 7. So, at this point, despite some of the favorites taking an L here or there, you have Bama has righted themselves. They're back in the conversation, and Florida State's gone down the tube. Right now, that loss is hurting them, but it's not really hurting them that much. You have Georgia's loss to Alabama, of course, going to put Alabama above them. You have Oregon's 1 loss now against Indiana, which makes Indiana be the one that's really flying high, and the hype is finally coming up to the Hoosiers, to where Vannini's kind of finally put Indiana with some semblance of credit. And on the field, they've dominated everyone that they've played, besides a tight matchup against Penn State, surprisingly enough. But at this time, Indiana looking like the most dominant team. Them and Ohio State kind of an edge above everyone else in one of those biggest two conferences of the Big Ten and the SEC. But yeah, LSU, while not looking entirely great overall, did rebound fairly well after the Ole Miss game. Unfortunately, you see the single week after, they lose to Vandy, and they're completely wiped from the board. You see BYU finally getting some credit at 8-0, and maybe you're going to get two Big 12 teams. Texas Tech and BYU. This is the point. Texas Tech's actually got the one loss, and BYU hasn't lost yet, but they're still going to match up very soon. And Notre Dame is slowly grinding up. And then you got to keep up with the next two ACC teams in Virginia and Louisville. That win against James Madison is actually helping Louisville out, surprisingly. And now we made it to the second weekend of November. Finally getting into the first playoff rankings that's officially on the board. Trying to get a difference of what the Athletic puts out. In this case, Indiana won. Well, the top six is staying as the same as the week before. You get Texas Tech rising, BYU rising, Oregon rising, Louisville rising. Miami falls after a second loss to SMU, who isn't even anywhere on the board. And then it leads to what he would predict as BYU getting in as the 8th seed, Texas Tech is the 7. Louisville will end up being the top representative for the ACC, with Miami being the second one. The two losses did not affect Miami too much at this point. You're starting to get to the point with these first playoff rankings that you see behind Miami is all a bunch of two-loss teams, and the only ones that aren't two-loss teams below them in those Power Four are the couple of ACC teams that really didn't have much of a schedule so far in Virginia and Georgia Tech. Both of them, their schedules pick up very soonly after this. Yes, unfortunately, at this point, we've had, right before the first playoff rankings, Vandy had already lost to Bama pretty convincingly and just got their second loss, nearly coming back to beat Texas. So, unfortunately, we do not get the chance to see Vanderbilt on a playoff rankings, even at the very beginning. The trend of them being on the outside looking in kind of continues through the rest of the season, and that's even including the Heisman voting for Pavia. The second week of playoff rankings, not much really changes, except for the fact you had Louisville get their second loss of the season, really drop them down after losing to SMU. And then you have BYU lose their first matchup against Texas Tech. And at that point, it really drops them down from any of those likely contenders for the top 12, really on the outside looking in with Vandy and Georgia Tech. But fortunately for Georgia Tech's and BYU's credit, both of them at this time still have a chance with the conference tournament, their conference championship. Vandy does not. And really same thing with Utah as well. The only other thing that carried weight into this last ranking for the second playoffs was the fact that Memphis ended up losing a surprising game to UAB, which really knocked them out of any chance of being able to compete, but still just right behind Tulane. So once you get that matchup of Tulane and Memphis, they could end up just bouncing themselves right back up into place. But South Florida at this point at 22 is the now prohibited favorite to be the Group of 5 representative. And then also at the top, need I not forget the fact that Ohio State also did jump Indiana after their comfortable win over Purdue, but more for the fact that Indiana barely squeaks by with a win over a James Franklin-less Penn State team. Now, after this week, the third playoff rankings, he does end up ranking Miami all the way up to 8 and Oklahoma at 7 after Oklahoma beats Alabama. Miami ends up getting a convincing win against NC State, and you get Notre Dame convincingly beat a ranked Pitt team who, even with the losses, all the way just down at 21. But more of the factor is Oregon is ranked number 11, and based off of who would be the automatic bids for the ACC and the group of 5, that would put Oregon as that first team out as a one-loss team below the likes of 2-loss Oklahoma, Miami, Notre Dame, and Alabama. Now, you figured at that point, even with his rankings, Oregon was going to be able to fix that up. If they beat USC, if they beat Washington, they're going to get themselves back up, and those rankings will kind of fix themselves. But what the playoff committee themselves did not do, but Vannini does, is put Miami above Notre Dame this early in the process and right next to each other, to where it did make that head-to-head matchup definitely factor in. And then, yeah, Texas is 3 losses. Vandy, even in this case, Vandy's underneath Texas. So, unless there is complete chaos, everyone below Vandy that's not an ACC or Group of 5 team, they have no shot. And that kind of ended up being true at the end as well. As you can see, yeah, you'd have potentially Miami, Notre Dame getting a rematch again. You have Oklahoma, Alabama getting a rematch after Oklahoma just beat Bama. Yeah, you get the matchup of the 2 Texas teams to go against Georgia, and then Ole Miss, Virginia. And in this case, we're literally the last 3 weeks of the season, or the last 3 playoff committees. So, going into right before Thanksgiving, the week of Thanksgiving, which is a bunch of, well, the previous week was a bunch of lackluster games, all of the real cupcake wins that the majority of teams got, so nothing really was going to change. The difference on Thanksgiving weekend, you see top 6 do not change, but with Oregon beating USC, the course correction goes on. Oregon jumps all three of Oklahoma, Miami, Notre Dame, and Alabama as a 4th. So Oregon, the bottom of those one-loss Power 2 conferences with the SEC and the Big Ten. But Oregon, if they beat Washington, they're securely in. And then you have those top 7 that is completely secure. There's nothing that they can do at this point that was really going to get them out. Georgia was still going to be in if they lost to Georgia Tech, even though Georgia Tech's all the way down here at 22. A&M, they just have Texas left. They're going to be in regardless. Texas Tech, they were going to have a rematch coming up with BYU, so they're probably going to be in regardless anyway. Ole Miss just has to beat Mississippi State. This is all the way through the Kiffin drama before any of the final actions end up going through. And then, yeah, as long as everything else stays square, it felt like this was going to be the final factor of these top 12. Well, these top 11 were going to make it in, but maybe take out Miami or Notre Dame and replace them with the ACC champ, as Miami was already out, and the group of 5. In this case, your highest one being North Texas, and then you have Tulane and Navy right behind. Those 3 being the last ones factoring in to potentially be in the Conference Championship of American. And you really did not believe that James Madison was actually just one after. So one of those 4 teams you figure was going to make the field, and then some ACC Drek was going to come in as that 11 seed overall, and then get whipped up as a road dog in the first round of the playoff. In this case, they thought, okay, that could be Virginia, it could be SMU, could be Pitt, could be Georgia Tech. But then there's the also very possible scenario of 3 combination of teams losing would lead to Duke potentially being in the ACC championship game as a 5-loss team, including 3 losses outside of conference. So going into the last week of the regular season, you kind of had a good idea. SEC was going to get their automatic qualifier in. Big Ten was going to get their automatic qualifier in. You had Texas Tech or BYU was going to be an automatic qualifier as the auto bids. And you get the top 5 conference champs to automatically make the field. The ACC, on the other hand, you were thinking there would be at the point that they are going to be the 4th highest conference champ overall, where you had the option of it being Virginia, and then you would think very likely 3 other options to potentially make the conference championship and win the conference championship as a 1 or 2 loss or maybe even 3 loss team overall, and any of them would overmatch what you think the ranking would be for a second group of 5 or even the first group of 5. Now you had that dangerous scenario of, yes, Virginia beats Virginia Tech, so they clinch real easy. Miami beats Pitt. They still need tiebreakers to happen to get them in. You had Georgia Tech already had done all their conference games, so they were not going to factor in unless Duke and SMU would lose. Unfortunately, with the only ones that were in conference, Virginia got himself clinched. Duke beat North Carolina, not really so convincingly, but they got the win in the rivalry game. The last ACC game of the season, that was a regular season game. Cal comes back in a back and forth affair with SMU, ends up getting a last minute win over Southern Methodist, which leaves the ACC championship game with Virginia and 7-5 Duke Blue Devils. Now, Duke throughout this whole season, a very strong offense. Darian Mensah, Tulane transfer. He has shown he's been basically worth the money that they gave him. And even Kuiper's putting him as potentially like a top 5 quarterback in this upcoming class. They just can't stop anybody. And it showed with all of their losses. Now, according to Vannini's board, even for the fact that Miami had the 2 losses and that the playoff board had Miami near 11, he was consistently putting Miami as a host site as early as week 11. So most of those playoff rankings, Miami was consistently going to be in there despite their 2 losses and despite the actual playoff committee not giving them all the flowers that they deserved. And they figure it's like, okay, Virginia's probably going to end up getting that ACC bid. There's no way that Duke's going to end up winning this game. The Cavaliers basically blew them out. It wasn't even close. And then after the conference championships, we have our final polls where we had Indiana overtake Ohio State to get that is the 1 and 2. Indiana defeated Ohio State 1 loss. They didn't drop any further with getting a loss to another undefeated team. A lot of the rest from 5 down to 10 stayed the same. Tulane getting their win over North Texas, ended up securing their 11 seed. And then James Madison getting the 12 seed with their win over Troy. If Virginia had ended up beating Duke, the only change that would have happened would have been James Madison would have been knocked out. Tulane would be the 12 seed. And the 11 seed would be Virginia going against Ole Miss, which is what they had set up for the previous week. In this scenario, conveniently, you would still get 2 rematches in the first round. In this case, Miami-Notre Dame, which has been kind of the standard for the last 4 weeks of the season. And in this case, there would be no Alabama. One of the biggest issues that you figured that the playoff committee was going to have to deal with based off of the teams that did make the field, didn't make the field, and the ones that would have that extra game of a conference championship, in this same case as well, it would not have mattered based off of the resume of Alabama or BYU had they just not played that conference championship game. Neither one of them would have made the field regardless. Everyone else who made the field that played in the game, the conference championship did not matter. It may have moved the spot one or the other, mostly in the case of the Ohio State-Indiana game. It was the winner of 2 undefeated teams, so no one was really going to argue on that. The rest of the way, 3 through 10 did not change. No conference championship affected anything in that matter. The only thing that did end up mattering is Alabama got blown out. In this case, Alabama would not have been in before the conference championship. BYU got blown out. They would have not been in the conference championship game without that conference championship win. You could go through the scenarios of BYU getting in, then Oklahoma would be out, or Alabama also winning, then Notre Dame would get out, and so on and so forth. You did have from that in this sort of aesthetic that Vannini displays throughout the season, these top 8s were going to be set in place regardless of conference championship scenarios. But from that, the very small differences that ended up playing out, basically halfway through the season, what happened in the true field was what Vannini ended up making after week 6. Not in that same order, and not including the 2 group of 5 teams, because no one was really expecting the ACC to go completely down the drain. And the most applicable option for the automatic bid would have been a 5-loss team. While the College Football Playoff Committee controversially slowly brought Notre Dame closer to Miami in the rankings, just enough to the last week to where they would be right next to each other based off of what happened in the Big 12 championship game. Let me just put it straight and plainly. The only way Notre Dame was going to be above Miami in Vannini's poll was going to be if Miami had another loss more than the Fighting Irish. After that case, it was plain and simple. The head-to-head was going to be the difference. Alabama's more impressive strength of schedule and strength of record, especially in that 4-game stretch of them winning against ranked SEC opponents, the Georgia, the Missouri, the Vanderbilts, and Tennessee. In Vannini's rankings, he would have ranked them above Alabama because of Alabama having the worst loss out of anybody amongst the at-large contenders within college football. So Notre Dame would have gotten a nod over Alabama, but just strength of record, strength of schedule, and quality top 25 wins with Alabama is what ended up getting them over Notre Dame at the very end. And now we have our actual playoff where 2 more rematches. Then you have 2 teams that played Notre Dame with Miami and Texas A&M. Both of them in this case beating Notre Dame. So we'll see what happens. Playoff officially starts this upcoming weekend on the 19th, only a couple days away. We'll see who ends up holding up the national trophy at the beginning of the year. A lot of them are favoring it to be Indiana, Ohio State, Georgia. I know that's a bit of cop-outs for it being just the top 3 seeds, but last year, none of the top 4 seeds ended up winning a single game. So if it goes in that same vein, then one of these first-round constituents are going to end up being your national championship. We'll see what happens. But thank you all for watching. I understand this is a bit of a longer video, kind of going through this thought experiment and the idea of the analytical view going throughout the entirety of this season, how it was updated, how it all kind of commenced throughout week by week, how big each of these losses ended up factoring in, and how much they could have commenced and brought themselves back into the pack as we got into November and December. But yeah, thank you all for watching. More videos coming soon. If Michigan's coach didn't get fired for his content, I will have likely done a new coach's video on this more recently than this, but once they get the replacement for Sherrone Moore, I'll make a video on the Power 4 and some of the replacements for some of the key group of 5 teams that ended up getting coaches changed for better or for worse. And yeah, more videos coming soon. Thank you all for watching.